Does it give you the little notification this week?
It does, yeah.
It doesn't tell me that, which is fun. Um, okay, well, hello, Alex. It's funny because now the whole thing feels far more artificial than it did just 18 seconds ago before I hit the record button. And everything that we had a good energy going, and now it's going to feel stilted and stifled. But
I won't let it.
please don't.
I'll breathe life back into it if need be.
Exactly. Okay, so why don't you introduce yourself and just explain how we met? Because I don't remember. I remember meeting some other people from that trip, but I don't have a specific moment or memory of meeting you. So I'd be curious
Mhm.
to hear if you have a distinct memory. I think I have distinct memories with others, like Eric. Like I have one with him, but I don't think I remember meeting you with any sort of specific memory
To
attached
be
to
completely honest, I don't recall either, and that's either
it.
a good or a bad thing.
We'll call it
But
good. We'll call it a seamless transition.
I'll agree with that. I'm Alex. I know we met at Oxford University as a part of a University of Toronto summer abroad trip. I believe that we met at the bar is what I'm going to go with as,
Probably.
explanation for our lack of memory regarding it.
Yeah, probably. I remember very little about that afternoon, except that we did the walking tour and we ended at the, oh, I don't remember the name. I could find it, but we were supposed to be there for a quick pop in. Many people didn't even touch a drink because they just don't drink, and fair enough. And then others had one. Eric and I stayed for 8 hours. 8 hours. We got
That follows, yeah.
and I'm sure you made an appearance. I don't remember, but because you would have popped. I know you would have stayed for a little bit.
Oh,
Uh,
absolutely. Especially given the environment as well. And the
oh
two of you.
yeah, it was. Well, we'll have to get to all of it. If not today, another time as well. But yeah. So here's I wanted to have you on because you're a friend, but also because you have a unique perspective as someone who was considering law school and then thought against it. Excuse me, which is a running joke and stereotype in the which drives me crazy because I don't understand what the motivation is. And the stereotype is you'll talk to any lawyer, and if you're mingling at a party or you're shooting the breeze, they'll tell you, "Oh, don't be a lawyer, don't be a lawyer." And then on the other, and then they'll say that with the left hand, so to speak. And then with the right hand, they'll go, "Oh, being a lawyer is the greatest." So it's like make up your minds. So as someone who strongly considered it and has now found, a really fun uh, career in the immediate aftermath of deciding not to go, and you've spoken very highly of what you're doing. I'd love to hear you talk more about that. So I leave it to you to go about how you want to introduce that part of your life and how you're keeping yourself busy these days.
No, I think it's a great question and definitely a reason I wanted to come on because I had predicted that that would be a topic because it's something we've discussed extensively as well in our conversations. Regarding the lawyer stereotype, I've also heard that quite often. And I think it's important to note what lawyers you're speaking to. I think that oftentimes kind of has an influence on their perspective on the industry. Bay Street law, like you said, I believe, might influence a certain attitude, let's say, versus maybe
Yes.
someone who's in house or working in like a not for profit or something similar.
Mm-hmm.
But onto my own personal perspective, I think both of us kind of had the idea to attend law school at first, just mostly relating to like our academic interest, right? Really interested in the issues and the implications of the different legal matters, and what better way to dive into that than law school, right? I remember I was actually listening to one of your other videos and I thought it was really interesting the way you discussed kind of like a master's degree and law school and how that kind of fit in to like your current class dynamic. And I thought that was really interesting just because you mentioned it yourself that people don't see law school necessarily in the same light as other graduate programs. It's like a
Mm-hmm.
professional degree. I never really thought about that. But in regards to my own personal experience, I kind of had the idea that if law is something I really want to pursue, then maybe I should try to dive into the matter of it in a professional sense before learning the theoretical background. And if it's something that ultimately I'm interested in the future, I can always return, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
that kind of happened to me working in anti-money laundering compliance. There's definitely a lot of legal issues going around the world today in that field, and kind of engaging myself in that field has been very rewarding from a personal perspective. And it's definitely like encouraged me to kind of like dive into the law surrounding it as well. And maybe it's something I'll explore in the future. No current plans on that, but I'm sure you have thoughts about, you know, where I should go and if it's something worth pursuing in the future.
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing is, you make a good point because the law isn't going anywhere, and it's something that's always changing, and different perspectives are always coming to light. And of course, they correspond to different challenges. So, globalization and these international organizations that are just rife for the possibility of money laundering or these sort of gray area on a sliding scale of gray area to full on criminal activity. Like you just become more vulnerable to that, and if not more vulnerable, my guess would be that just it's kind of like it seems artificially inflated because there are just more examples of it. So if you know if you're limited to your town, if you're working on anti-money laundering or you're a lawyer in one little town, you're probably gonna have pretty quiet days for a really long.
Mm-hmm.
Working in downtown Toronto on the internet, there's no end to it, and there's no end in sight, I imagine, and that's a good thing. And you're learning from other countries too. So I'd love to hear you chat about that because I'm sure what you're doing it requires you to keep up on what's going on in Toronto and then in Ontario and then Canada, but then also globally and of course the US right next door. So I'd be curious to hear more about that. And again, I want to talk to you because I want you to tell me about what it is that you're into. So despite the name of the podcast, I'd like to chat as little as possible and let you go about it. But I'll just respond to your comment about how how law school can feel like graduate school. I think it just boils down to this. I think at the first year level, there is that stereotype of, I don't want to say weeding through the weaklings because that's an unfair way of putting it, but they do tax you with quite a bit of work. And then as you progress, you start to pick the courses that you like better. And it's just like undergraduate studies, right? You have 200 people in a class, or in the case of law school, it ends up being 50 or 75. And then you're down to 10. And then my one class, which is actually very closely related to what you're doing, corporate governance. So there's like 8 people in that class. So it's really cool and intimate. But tell me about your day to day, and tell me about it before COVID, and then tell me during, and tell me if the difference is crazy or not.
Absolutely. And definitely a great question to bring up is the pre-COVID and post-COVID environments. Not even talking from an anti-money laundering perspective, but a global company perspective. Because a lot of these downtown Toronto companies are obviously like behemoths who employ thousands of employees, and shifting those employees to a fully virtual environment was a huge undertaking. And I'm sure a lot of other companies ran into issues as well. To kind of go off your first point in regards to kind of like the global nature of money laundering and how that fits into the law, I guess, is essentially, I'm going to start off with the international body known as FATF, which is the Financial Action Task Force. Essentially, they make recommendations to certain countries in terms of their anti-money laundering laws and policies. So the interesting thing and the way this fits in with international law, at least from what I know of, is that these laws aren't binding in any way. They're merely recommendations, but there's kind of an attitude of silencing the minority in a sense, where if a country doesn't abide by the recommendations, they're kind of left in the cold versus other countries. And so a lot of these countries, especially in the banking world, where sanctions can have such a huge impact on the economy of a country, as well as the financial well-being of a company, you want to try to adhere to these recommendations so that you can participate in the financial world, right?
So that would be like a soft power mechanism. So I won't use
absolutely, yeah,
pressure, but
absolutely, but that's what it essentially is at the end of the day.
Cool. Okay.
And the way that kind of like, yeah, so there you go. And the way that kind of fits in with Canada is Canada has one broader reporting entity, which is known as FinTrack, which is the financial transaction. Oh, we'll look it up after and we'll edit it in. But it's quite an acronym regardless. So essentially all regulated financial entities must report to FinTrack according to the Anti-Money Laundering Law in Canada, which is the Proceeds of Crime and Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing Act of Canada.
See, now you're giving me homework because this is I'm sure I'll encounter it, but
Especially in your corporate governance class.
I'm sure it'll come up
I'm
at
sure
some
that it's something
point.
that, or if not anti-money laundering, but like broader compliance, without a
Mm.
doubt. So if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up.
I
Maybe we can learn from
I
each other.
I will, and I'm gonna ask you to chat, and then I can blow the teacher away. I mean, she'll say that's not even in the book. I'll go, don't worry about it. I love it.
That's what I want to try to encourage.
Cool, man.
um,
So yeah. Oh, sorry.
like I was saying, essentially all regulated financial entities must report suspicious activity to FinTrack. And so regulated entities obviously include banks, but also businesses like currency exchangers who fall under the classification of a money service business,
Mm.
cryptocurrency exchanges. There's a whole wallop of different financial entities that fall under these laws. And so essentially my role working at a big five bank is operating in that and reporting suspicious activity when we see it to FinTrack, as well as trying to mitigate the risk that these kind of criminal activities can pose to a financial institution. A big kind of like noteworthy thing that I want to touch on for your viewers, just because I think it illustrates the impact of these potential breaches really well, is most recently Westpac Bank in Australia had a very bad reputation for anti-money laundering breaches. Essentially, there was thousands of transactions relating to child exploitation, human trafficking, all sorts of other terrible
Oh,
things that
wow.
went unreported. And as a result, AUSTRAC, which is due to FinTrack in Canada, is also the regulating entity in Australia,
Mm-hmm.
fined the bank $1.3 billion relating to these anti-money laundering breaches. And obviously, for a global bank, you might say that's 6 months profit. What's the big deal? But at the end of the day, that's a huge fine, and that's, I believe, probably only the second or third largest fines that we've ever seen in
Wow.
anti-money laundering before. And so it kind of like shows the impact, not only from the human perspective, allowing these kind of terrible criminal activities where I think true evil really resides to occur, but also the financial impact it can have on a large bank as well.
Interesting. So, what would you consider, or rather, what constitutes some sort of aberrant economic activity where alarm bells start to go off? Because something like, and actually, with respect to this, to the case you just mentioned, has it ever been the case? So, it's two questions. The first question is, how do you define those unusual economic transactions and activities? And then on the other hand, has it ever kind of happened where it's been backfilled, where you hear about a criminal matter unfolding, and then you think, okay, let's look at the financial side of this, and then the investigation from an anti-money laundering perspective
Mm-hmm.
after the fact. So the person's already been suspected of something in the criminal realm, and then you think, well, let's just take a look at this bank account because that must happen.
Oh, absolutely. And that's something great that you touched on. So, relating to the second question, I'll touch on because that's the more interesting of the two. It's something that comes up very often in what we call adverse media screening. So, essentially, you must see news articles of, oh, X individual charged with drug trafficking,
Oh yeah,
and
all the time.
obviously these names and these activities are screened against current bank customers. And if there is deemed to be a positive match, then that's something obviously we act on, and we review the customer's account to see if there's been any exposure to that crime that was reported on
Mm-hmm.
in the news article. But there's also many other things that come with name screening, most of which relate to political entities as well as sanctions. So Justin Trudeau, for example, would obviously fall under a politically influenced person who would then be obviously regulated, and his accounts would be paid closer scrutiny just because of his access to public funds.
Interesting. So that that makes me that makes me wonder, and we've chatted about this in person, and it's been a while, but and this was pre-COVID. It was actually, I think you were the one of the last people I saw. I think
I do remember that actually. Yeah.
we met up in March, and that's a whole other can of worms. But I remember you mentioning it. Now you just reminded me. Where does the customer? So it's just this is a guy with a checking account. Let's say where does the line between privacy uh, and duty to investigate begins? Because I mean, the only knowledge I have of any of these matters is through stereotypes on television and what you've shared with me in the sporadic times we've chatted. But you know, I get, and this actually goes to my first question a moment ago. Like, is a guy who goes to the bank and deposits $10,000 cash every day for a month, is that going to be flagged? Is that a bank policy? Is that a criminal policy? How do you guys tackle stuff like that? Because I do remember you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So, what do you think?
Great question. I think
that
that's based off what you were touching on before in terms of kind of like red flags and alarm bells. I'll touch on that a little bit too. So FATF, this body that I was speaking of before, part of their recommendations actually in the same kind of document, they also release red flag indicators, suspicious indicators of money laundering. And this takes like many forms. The obvious one is what you just discussed, which is $10,000 a day for a month. And obviously that's a classic money laundering typology in the sense that, you know, that's what we call structuring. So in the same, along the same idea, all transactions over $10,000 have to be reported in a currency transaction report. So what criminals will obviously try to do to avoid this is deposit, let's say, $4,000 a day at different banks, for example, to try to avoid this reporting requirement. Obviously, all these banks, you know, are trying to, especially now, really embrace technology and technological solutions to a lot of these issues. It's very difficult to have an army of you know, minions looking at every single account and every single transaction and trying to figure out whether or not this is money laundering, because realistically it's impossible. We operate on very limited information. At the end of the day, we have basic know your customer information in front of us, like your address, your residency, stuff like that, and your account activity, and that's all we really can go off of. So along the same lines, we operate on what I like to call a risk-based kind of mindset. So it's not about whether or not we can say yes or no, this is definitively criminal activity, but what's the risk in terms of what's the customer's residency? Are they connected to anybody? Are they connected to any politically influenced people? Are they connected to any criminal organizations? And then we can kind of build the puzzle of whether or not the risk is maybe too high and we need to report this activity to FinTrack based off kind of the risk they pose to the bank in both their activities and kind of like their personal profile.
Interesting. That's so fascinating because I just got off the heels of binging The Sopranos, and
a great one.
Oh my God. And, you know, of course everything they're doing is legal. So all that money, I mean, he just keeps wads of cash lying around, right? But, and this is 20 years ago. So it was probably much easier even then, just 20 years ago, to get away with things. It just boggles my mind to think about how, you know, anytime you have a bank account, anytime you're engaging with these mega institutions that are, you know, for better or for worse, the lifeblood of entire countries. Like the notion that you for a second could think that, oh, I won't be. They have your address, like it's right there. It's just fascinating to me how much information is shared and how bounded we are to just the daily activities we undertake, especially as it pertains to financial matters. So, are we a bit laggy? Did I lose you a little bit?
I definitely want to touch on what you said before about privacy concern.
Oh, yeah, I think, yeah. I see you. Are we good?
We're all good?
I think so. If
you can hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, you did like cut out for a second there, but you came back pretty fast, so.
My next tattoo is going to be backwards. Your internet connection is unstable. This is the story of my life, especially in class. But yeah, tell me more about privacy and tell me how that unfolds.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to touch on that as well, because not even just like in terms of regulation, but also personally, I think it's something that both of us can kind of struggle with, because money laundering can sounds good.
Okay.
So I'll touch on the privacy thing that we were discussing before.
Yeah, and I can edit out, and I will edit out those chunky parts, because I did a test before I called you of how this is processed. Obviously, I've never been a Zoom host before now. you can, as soon as you hang up, it's actually pretty cool. And I think you told me this, so here's me preaching to the choir. But it starts to encode and process right away, which is actually amazing. I wish my podcasts and my own videos did that instead of having to go through software and do it myself. I wish it would just auto process.
Oh no, Zoom's great.
Yeah, it really is. Zoom did COVID. I mean, that's the conspiracy. I'm convinced that someone at Zoom unleashed this upon the world. They've made a lot of money since March.
If you look at their share price and how it increased since March, I think the numbers speak
I don't
for
know.
themselves.
So you're the man on the inside. Go take a look at Zoom. I don't know.
Yeah, that's true.
All right, man.
So I want to talk about this privacy thing because I think it's really interesting, and I think you'll get a kick out of it too, just because privacy is a big issue in today's day and age with things like the internet, social media, government influence, all kinds of nonsense. And people are really worried about, the personal information that they put out there and whether or not it'll ever get used against them, right?
Yeah.
So going off of what we were talking about in terms of the way money laundering and privacy kind of intersect, money laundering in Canada, big stop, is a large issue currently. And the Cullen Commission out of British Columbia is examining that right now. And that's something that maybe, we can talk about more in detail in the future. But the big finding is that, money laundering in British Columbia through real estate and casinos is a massive issue. And it's, we're having trouble stopping it, right?
Yeah,
and
you
so you
mentioned that, I remember.
kind of brings up this broader conversation about something that other countries have put into place, but Canada hasn't been on the forefront of that. It's something called a universal beneficial ownership registry. So in terms of real estate. So in other countries, essentially you'll be able to see who owns what real estate, and they'll be fully public.
Oh, wow.
And if it's a shell company, the shell company will have to declare its ultimate owners. And from a personal perspective, this sounds kind of troublesome, right? Just because, for example, I happen to be a rich billionaire and I want to hide the fact that I have billions because I don't want, for whatever reason, like I don't have to give a reason, right? It's my own money. I've earned it completely legitimately, that, people know that I own this home in Vancouver. But on the other side of the coin, if I was, for example, a criminal billionaire who had earned my millions through human trafficking and other terrible things, how are we going to figure that out?
Right.
Unless through standardized like anti-money laundering policies? It seems very difficult to do, and balancing the privacy coin is something that is still being talked about today on the global level, and how we're going to be able to do that. And I'm interested in your thoughts on how we can balance kind of both people's privacy rights, but also this money laundering issue that we have, not only in Canada, but the rest of the world as well.
Well, I'm actually surprised to hear you say that, because my take on privacy in general is, forget, philosophical positions on it. I'm speaking strictly technically. I don't know how much is left private anyway, and I'm not too happy about that, let's say. But how difficult would it be if you were just the average Joe walking down the street and you see this massive mansion? How difficult truly would it be to inquire about who actually owns that property? Like there are channels, through which people can discover this. It's not, like real estate transactions aren't, I mean, maybe I'm making a fool of myself and I'm wrong here, but I don't think that they're private or need to be. So maybe I'm just completely ignorant on it. I'm just saying, like, it strikes me as odd that it would be that it would be such a troubling issue in British Columbia, for instance, or anywhere, because given how robust our institutions are in Canada and how entrenched and elaborate the recording, just the methods of recording all kinds of transactional data, how that wouldn't be available to a government agency, assuming you get past the privacy hurdle and the legal hurdles. Like the data is there, the information is there. I don't know how difficult, but you tell me. I mean, I don't know, but you see a condo go up on Lakeshore in Toronto, and most of those units are empty, let's say, but they're there and they've been built, and they're Airbnbs or they're whatever they are. Maybe they're, God knows what's going on inside. I'm just wondering how. I mean, tell me what makes it so difficult.
Mm-hmm. So there's a very interesting aspect of that I think you'll enjoy as well, as someone who's in law school. So quite a few years ago, I don't know the exact year, but initially the FinTrax regulation in terms of the proceeds of crime, money laundering, terrorist financing act, all that nonsense, involved a specific reporting requirement for lawyers, which for me is fundamentally very interesting because, a big part of our legal system and why it's so great is is attorney-client privilege,
Yeah, of
right?
course.
And that's kind of fundamental in our legal system and the way people are supposed to represent themselves.
Hmm.
And having a reporting requirement for suspicious activity in terms of financial activity was very interesting just because it feels like it almost supersedes a client's right to representation and a fair representation at that.
Hmm.
And apparently the Supreme Court agreed because they ended up slamming that down as well. So lawyers are no longer required to report in Canada. But as a result of that, and this kind of flips on the privacy coin as well, it's very easy for someone to pay a lawyer for representation and have a shell company created by the lawyer go in and purchase real estate, and it's in the lawyer's name. And ultimately, you have no idea who actually owns that property or where the money came from. Because if I go up to a realtor and say I can pay $3 million cash for this home, and they're not going to inquire where that money come from, they're not going to inquire what the money is being used for, just simply put, because that realtor wants that $30,000 commission. And even though real estate entities are technically a regulated entity by FINTRAC, their reporting numbers are terrible. You see many, many transactions go unreported that probably should have. And these are the findings of the Cullen Commission. You go read about them for yourself. Is the fact that we need to beef up these real estate reporting kind of like frameworks if we want to improve this money laundering problem out of British Columbia. And that's only really if, for instance, lawyers, are ever willing to maybe return to reporting. And I don't really see that coming in the future. But I'm interested on your like theoretical thoughts on that.
Yeah, that is interesting. And you sparked a thought about let me just gather my thoughts.
It's a lot of information
It is.
we're
No, no, it
dissecting
is.
here. So
It is, but that's the joy of it. Oh, I was going to ask you, do you think that the whole process and the system, for lack of a better word, is inadequate just because of, do you think that the inadequacy that, you guys are encountering is a matter of just lag between how quickly life is and technology and globalization has sped up in the last, 25 years since we've been alive? I have to imagine that's part of it as well, right? Because we're not in 2120 where, you know, entire generations are familiar with internet transactions and real estate, international real estate transactions. I mean, this is with the exception of the ultra wealthy in centuries past, this is a new phenomenon.
mhm.
A wealthy individual, even 100 years ago, would have to be supremely wealthy to make purchases internationally, right? If we're talking about wealth disparity, if we're talking about just access to resources, even just the means of learning about something for sale, in the south of France, if it's 1920 and you're some hotshot in Toronto, you'd have to go inquire. You'd have to. Whereas now it's like homes for sale in France, condos for sale in Vancouver, things like that. So I'm just wondering if it's just a generational lag because of tech and we're just new to this, or I'm sure that's part of that. And then the second part of that question is it that, or is it these legal obstacles that get in the way, or what do you attribute the roadblock to more?
You parsed something very, very good there. And the fact is how wondrous the internet has been for criminals, but also normal people alike. The opportunities given by the internet now are infinite, and at the same time, same with being able to launder illegal drug money, for instance, right? And so what you said regarding technology and the regulations to kind of regulate it, I suppose, definitely is a part of it. Let's
Mm-hmm.
talk about cryptocurrency for a minute because I think that's a great example. Obviously, cryptocurrency kind of has a reputation for being the heart of criminal activity, and I don't think that's necessarily true, but that's beside the point.
But shouldn't that?
Cryptocurrency.
I'm sorry to interject.
No, go ahead.
Wouldn't that blinding light on those sorts of transactions? They're certain they must be less common than your day-to-day conventional transactions.
Mm-hmm. So absolutely. Kind of a fun fact about that is that Chainalysis, which is a blockchain analytics firm, which reports an annual crime report regarding kind of Bitcoin transactions, all that kind of stuff. actually reported this year in their 2020 report that less than 1% of all Bitcoin transactions were linked to criminal activity. And you might be saying, oh, well, maybe that's only 1% that they know of. But the great part about cryptocurrency is that the blockchain is transparent. I can see the whole path of a Bitcoin from the moment it's mined to the moment that it passes through a darknet market into a drug dealer's pocket. You're able to follow it the whole time. Knowing the actual details of the individual who maybe holds those funds is a little more obscure, but you can see the entire path. So first off, it's definitely a myth that it's kind of the harbor of criminal activity. But back to your question regarding regulation. So FinTrack actually just released regulation that came into effect in June of this year regarding cryptocurrency exchanges and other kind of facilitators of virtual currency. And if you're like me, you think that that's kind of late, right? Like Bitcoin had its big
Yeah.
boom in 2017? That was 3 years ago. Why are
Mm-hmm.
regulations only coming into force now? And then you think about all maybe it's still only 1%, but Bitcoin's market cap is in the billions of dollars. So how much drug money was laundered through other cryptocurrency and other exchanges before the regulations came into place?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, but that's a great thing to think about. And like you said, technology is moving extremely fast and it's exponential. The amount of progress we've had in the last 10 years is only going to multiply in the next 10. And so it's going to be difficult for government regulators to kind of keep up with how fast the game is changing.
Yeah, no doubt. And yeah, it's just with every technological boom or with any boom of any sort, really, there's always going to be these little apertures where some savvy crook is going to find a way to exploit it. And then some savvy non-criminals, of course, are finding a way to leverage these new, rapidly changing technologies. And it's funny, I know nothing of cryptocurrency, quite literally nothing. So I'd love to chat with you, another time about that specifically, and we'll have to do that. But it's just fascinating to me how, 3 years sounds like a long time. It's not, right? I mean, even we met 3 years ago, but it feels like 5 minutes ago. And you can make a lot of money, theoretically, if you know what you're doing with something that's so volatile and so a hot potato. I don't know, like it's an intriguing thing. And what you said to me makes me think that now these regulations come into place, and now there's going to be this whole backlog of things that need to be perhaps investigated. And you're looking into matters that are already 3 years old, 4 years old, and you still have to keep your eye on what's happening at the present moment.
Mm-hmm.
When I was a kid, I would look at lawyers and I would look at bankers and people whose jobs required them to pay, to keep their eyes very close to really finite, not finite, really minute details. And, I would kind of, I was puzzled at how someone could spend their life doing that. It's like, you might be, investigating however many transactions, and that might take you 10 years, right? And there you go. So, very interesting stuff. Tell me, sir, what is the best part of the job? And actually, let's go back. Tell me how you filled your day before COVID, because I think I asked that before, but we talked about something less quotidian. So, but walk me through it because I can tell you my schedule, and it's less glitzy, I'm sure, and it's sitting on my ass, rolling out of bed, and it's like it's school, which is you get to an age where you're like, okay, I need to stop going to school.
Have you reached that age yet, do you think?
Yes and no. I mean, without taking us too far afield, my comment that you responded to about how this one class I'm taking feels like a master's degree. I never had that experience the way a lot of our peers did in undergrad, where they had a course or an assignment or whatever that required them to do a full-fledged research project. And I mentioned in an earlier video that as an English student, I was confined to the text, and then excuse me, and then the political science courses I took were political philosophy more than data and analyzing patterns. So I very little research was needed. But this one course I'm taking is a little bit more along the lines of a research course where we have to go out and look and find things to find relevant information and articles and data even to respond to the prof's manuscript. Um, so we'll see how I feel in a year and a half, and I might do a master's, but it would be something like it would be something closer to what you're doing in the sense that it would be a master's. It would be an LLM, but it would be closer to governance and maybe financial banking law, commercial law. I said I don't want to be a Bay Street guy, and I don't necessarily think I do, but I think that financial literacy is invaluable. So
Mm-hmm.
if it means doing an actual master's at a really cool school that takes me out of town, assuming we can get there, um, it would be an interesting opportunity. But no, I gotta get out and I gotta work. And so here's my segue, and it's rough. This is a rough segue. Um, I was downtown with my girlfriend uh, a month ago for a little staycation, which was really cool. Visit your own city. I highly recommend it. And we stayed across the street from your office building. And I remember sitting there, it was like a Monday, and I'm just thinking to myself, where are all these people? Of course, they're home. And so tell me about your daily routine before and after COVID, and then tell me what you think the office world will look like when COVID's done, and who's going back, who's paying for these office buildings? Like, how are these institutions gonna, if it's working now, and presumably it is, how does this, how does this look in 5 years or even in 2 years? So,
It's very cool, and I'm glad you pointed that out because
I
relating to
personally,
kind of
I'll tell
like
you, I'd rather be out the door. I can't sit at home. I love my family. I can't, man. I can't. I want to go out. I want to go be with people. I want to see strangers. I can't stay home. I'm going. That's why I started the podcast. Is I need to escape from the house.
you need a conduit for your mind. I agree with
Exactly.
that.
So tell me, like, lay it
Yeah,
on me. What do you think?
I'm glad that you brought that up because so a little while back I had a tech issue. I had to go to the office, get something replaced, right? And I remember it was just like a Tuesday afternoon, middle of the day. And normally, in the morning, 9 a.m., you take the subway, it's packed. You get to the office building, it's packed. And you kind of have this like buzz about it, right?
Mm,
Important people doing important things, I guess you could say. And I kind of like got addicted to that buzz for a while. It was very cool living in Toronto and doing those things. And I'm sure people who live in cities like New York or San Francisco probably feel the same way. It's almost addicting. But going there on like a Tuesday afternoon and it just being absolutely empty was very stunning to me. Just because like I hadn't been there in so long and I'd gotten used to this home lifestyle that it kind of all came crashing back at once. That this is our
mm.
reality now, and however long it's going to last for. So my routine before, I'd say, is probably actually surprisingly quite similar to yours, except I was going to an office building rather than a university, I suppose.
Mhm.
Get on the TTC in the morning, go to work for 8 or plus hours, whatever it requires, and then heading back home. Something that I do want to note is that I definitely have more time these days for activities like this, just because I'm not enjoying the Toronto commute for 2 hours a day, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like much more well rested. Yeah. But there is obviously the aspect of missing that human interaction. It's important to go outside. It's very easy when you get in a routine just to stay in your room and only leave for like groceries and such, which I guess realistically is probably the best decision for the pandemic in consideration and all. But for our human souls, maybe not so much. I'm actually interested on your thoughts on that about if not even just this pandemic, but if there's future pandemics that kind of ensue in the future, how kind of like the human condition will be influenced by us having to stay at home and discuss things virtually.
I think that this goes back to the internet thing. I think that I want to tread carefully here because I don't want to be misunderstood when I say this, but I think and I think you know me well enough to kind of guess at most of my philosophical leanings, especially as it pertains to interpersonal relationships and culture, and we've chatted about it before. I'm of the mind, I'll tell you, I was at school on March 12th. It was a Thursday, and there were whispers of, oh, well, maybe we're gonna have to stay home tomorrow. And sure enough, the 13th, Friday the 13th, uh, we were told to stay home and not come in. And at like 4 p.m. on Friday the 13th, I was over COVID. I was like, yeah, I hate this already. This is ridiculous. And of course, I'm being completely insensitive to those whose lives have either been lost or destroyed. So I realize that I'm being a bit of an idiot when I talk about this. But nevertheless, just from a purely philosophical point of view, and from a we have the time to reflect, so let's reflect. It's just untenable. If you if you 100 and I always go back, and that's kind of a recurring theme in the podcast as well, is I try to stay away from contemporary matters, but I'd like to comment on contemporary trends by looking at their historical antecedents, so other plagues, wars, conflicts, and just I try to emphasize how everything under the sun is always the same and is always going to be the same forever. Terrifying, but also encouraging. And so, before the advent of the internet, I can see how a population or a populace relying on the limited information that comes to them would be more willing, for lack of a better word, but also more impressionable, and but willing to do all that is necessary, because we had different lives 150 years ago, even in the lucrative and luxurious West. We, a lot, even just where people lived and the sort of daily activities they did. Our great grandparents lived completely different lives, and sometimes in the exact same cities. A far more hand to mouth existence, even for those who lived affluent lives. There was a connection to the physical world in a way that we don't have, especially now. So all I'm trying to say is that, how can you hide? I'm not saying hide, like I'm not suggesting that anything's being hidden. I'm sure plenty's being hidden, but I don't see how, let's say that the lockdown is lifted tomorrow, or 6 months from now, which seems more reasonable. If in 2022 or 3 we get whispers again, I don't know who's going to comply. I feel like people are going to go, you know what, it wasn't that bad last time, and think, you can draw those lines however you like. But people are going to go, I'm not doing this. And this is where I stand on this, Alex. Again, I acknowledge the fact that I've been safe and sound at home. I don't recall being guaranteed immortality. I don't recall being told I was going to live forever, and now this virus has spoiled my plans of immortal splendor on Mount Olympus. I recall being a human being who faces risks on a daily basis, who engages in activities that put the lives of others at risk, driving, just walking down the street, whatever, coughing even. This is part and parcel of being human. So all of this actually speaks to how ignorant we've become, this generation, the last 3 or 4, to be so bold as to assume that we were living without risk in the first place. Like, isn't that the sort of Western centric, or excuse me, isn't that the number one critique that you hear from other cultures and societies when they criticize the West? You don't know how good you have it. This is ridiculous, blah, blah, blah. You're all spoiled rotten. It's like, yes, we are. I don't recall ever being guaranteed 100 years on this planet. I could drop dead tomorrow. I'm not being callous, and I don't mean to be callous, but at a certain point, when are we going to have an honest discussion about who should be engaging in what kind of activities? My final comment, because I'm meandering like a bastard, but my final comment would be, this has been it's so discouraging, because this was such a perfect opportunity from a political standpoint to really affirm the bonds of communities, to say, you know what, young people, here's the data. I'm sorry, we claim as a society to be behind the science. Let's see if we can get you guys at least back to work, because, God forbid if you get sick, the prognosis is a far more, let's get the medical phraseology correct here, positive, meaning the outcome is going to be far less severe. So go brave it, go be brave, go work in those supermarkets. And of course, people have been and are, and you and I are very spoiled because we're at law school and we're working in finance, for God's sakes. Like, we have it good. But for this to turn sour and to go upside down and have people, nipping at each other's heels and fighting, I think it reveals just how bitter and confused we've been for the last 5-10 years specifically that we've been paying attention. And you and I have shared many a beer talking about how, and I know you're an outdoorsman, so I know that you appreciate being out there and having a physical connection to the world around you. It's just, I think that we're a bitter and confused generation, and this has revealed all of that. And my long diatribe is nearing its end, but I don't know what more to say other than I'm not going to call myself a skeptic, but I'm not, by no means am I willing. I mean, I'm in law school and I've studied political science, and I have old-fashioned parents and grandparents who remember horrific stories of tyrannical empires. I'm not willing to just at face value, I don't care where we live or at what time, abide by rules that haven't been openly discussed. Like, the mask mandate, for example, showed up as things were petering off, and it's like, well, nothing about the approach has been logical, which makes me bitter and cynical about the entire thing. I can't even talk to classmates about it because many of them are more disciplined adherents of public advice, but I'm sitting there like a bitter scoundrel. Like this is absurd after a certain point. Anyway, rant.
Yeah, I think the policies kind of like fall in line with what we were talking about how people think as well. Not even just about their society, but also themselves. It's been quite a wave, and it feels like every day brings new things and new policies and new challenges, I suppose. And
Mm-hmm.
going off of that, finding meaning, and we discussed this at length before about meaning and what that means to kind of like our age group, I suppose. And I love what you said about this pandemic kind of exposing the ugly side of that, because I really think it has.
Yeah, I sit and well, I mean, let's be very candid and let's be selfish. The notion of paying full tuition, this doesn't apply to me. This applies to everybody who's in school. The notion of paying full tuition, like it's amazing how these philosophical questions spring up because embedded in each of these decisions is a value system, so to speak, that produced this decision over this one, right? These are choices. So the choice, for instance, to keep tuition the same. Well, what that kind of speaks to is you value this learning environment through the screen as being identical to being
Mhm.
in person and doing it the way it's been done for millennia. So I don't know how to square that. And what troubles me the most, and this is what we can talk about at another time, is regardless of the year or the situation or whatever, it seems to me that the pattern has become we don't have these deep conversations and we have the means to do so. Um, and that, maybe that's an elitist way of thinking, maybe that's a privileged way of thinking because we have the luxury to take time and discuss. And there are people to this day living hand to mouth who literally do not have the time to ponder meaning in the universe because their meaning is I need to take care of myself and my family. But for those who are able and are in a privileged enough position, and I myself am among that group, and I don't want to speak on your behalf, but of course, we're peers for God's sake. Do we not have an ethical and a moral obligation to discuss honestly these ideas? Like, why? What is it? What are these degrees for? Why are we paying this money? Why are people's tax dollars subsidizing these institutions? Because that's the interesting part. If it was just my dad was a millionaire and here, Alexander, go to school, that would be that would be a different thing. But people's families are paying so we can go to U of T. Well, they get to see something out of that? So all of this starts to come crashing down. And when when we get caught up in foolishness and discussions that just don't matter, and the vacuity of certain topics like, oh, what's this person wearing today, and who dumped who, we got stuff we need to consider and discuss, and it just troubles me that we can't do that in a way that we should be. That's what makes podcasts interesting because chatting for an hour almost, and it felt like 5 minutes. I mean, we can keep going. I have nowhere to be, but stop me because I'm derailing the whole thing. I'm supposed to be interviewing you, but I want because I know that you have a similar attitude, and particularly because you are one, like I mentioned a moment ago, you are the kind of guy who loves to step away, and you are an outdoorsman. And I just went camping with my girlfriend the other day. Invaluable, right? If you can do it, you should, because you realize, oh my God, what am I getting? Why am I on Twitter? Like, what am I doing? So, like, let me know what you think. I'm just curious to know what are your thoughts on how all of this unfolds culturally? Like, how will this shape our thinking? Or are we so short-sighted and have such a poor memory that, the next one will come along and we'll just repeat all of this all over again?
So I think I want to segue this into a conversation about work and what
Please
that means
stop me.
from as a concept about work, because I think it's kind of synonymous with meaning. And a lot of people that I've read, while at U of T and afterwards, kind of have this attitude about capitalism, like think what you will, that work is somehow bad, or that, like you were saying, work somehow influences the way you think. And moving into a pandemic, obviously it's had an adverse economic impact on our country as well as a lot of others. So finding work now for a lot of people has been very difficult. And, I'm privileged to, be able to hold on to my job, and you privileged to stay a student. Absolutely. But we also have to consider what that kind of has meant for how we confer meaning in our lives, I think.
Mm,
Obviously, we're motivated and influenced by our day-to-day work and our day-to-day studies. But think for a second if you, for example, were someone who had just lost job and was trying to find meaning in just like their own self. I think that'd be very difficult to do. And I think that introduces a very interesting question about how we should consider work in our daily lives, because I've heard a lot of floating conversations about, yeah, I think we discussed this before, is about like work is somehow bad. But
mm,
I think we have to kind of switch that and say that unmeaningful work is bad, and try to
right.
focus on what that can bring to us in terms of both meaning and productivity. Because I really think that happy people are happy workers at the end of the day. And maybe that's just like a capitalist viewpoint, who knows? But
No, I
I
don't
think
think
the
you're.
two have some kind of link even outside of that. And I think even like a socialist or someone who has a different economic perspective can somewhat agree with that.
Yeah, I think that if you flatten everything down to, and this is what we failed to do, and this is what motivated my long diatribe a moment ago. If you flatten things down to human tendencies and human patterns of behavior, two things happen. One, it's humbling because you realize that there are countless figures like yourself throughout history. And it's actually discouraging if you have a creative bent, because you sit and you think, well, anything that's ever been painted, written, or put into music has already been said. So, where do I fit into this? So it's a grateful perspective, because you can look at what's come before you, and I encourage people to be grateful about that, because I can put on Bach right now, and it's like the ability to access that is stunning, to use your word from earlier. But we need to keep those human universals in mind, and we need to think about, okay, well, can I really not work? And then let's have an honest discussion about how me not working, or not just me, anybody, the average individual, choosing or not choosing to not work, what does it, you'd have to define work first of all, and then you'd have to explore what that does to your soul. Forget your pocketbook. What does that do? Because I have a part-time job right now. It bothers me to all hell. It's the job in between university and law school. But I used to bitch and moan when I had to go into the office. I really did, because it was like, oh, this is, what I'm doing isn't meaningful. What I'm doing, da, da, da. What kind of inane tasks that are ahead of me for this 8-hour day? And it's like, no, no, that's completely the wrong way of thinking about it. And again, I acknowledge the luxury of being able to just get up and leave and find another job. So that's part of it. I'm not ignorant of that. But I can only speak from within my paradigm and my perspective. Well, what can it do? What does the job do? Well, it lets me buy the books I want to buy, and it lets me give to the charities I want to give. And then I get along with my coworkers better, because I know that their labors, to use a hot button word, translate to cooperative output that actually lets me transform the world around me. Like, I think we need to glorify everything we do. We're so pessimistic. And I say that on the heels of a long pessimistic speech, but like, there's this interplay between gratefulness and gratitude, and uh, and just gratitude, because you need to look at it and go, we have inherited all of this. I don't know how to build a light bulb. I don't know how to build a computer. I don't know how to program Zoom. I don't know anything. And yet we walk around with the audacity to complain about things. So let's begin with gratitude, and then explore your interests, but forget your interests, even if you can't and you have to do the job. I'll give you a personal example that's very private to me and my family. A loved one who's lost his job, and it's almost akin to the stereotypical story you hear of immigrant families who come over, and they were engineers and doctors and lawyers, and they're forced, for lack of a better word, to take work that is beneath them. And on the one hand, I don't like that phrase, because work is work and it sustains you, and it's valuable because maybe it keeps your children fed and it keeps their hopes and dreams alive. So I don't know how you put a dollar value on that. And many parents would be willing to do that. But here he is, and he's working at a supermarket on the overnight shift, cutting fruit. And it's like, this is a middle-aged man who works very hard at what he does. But he's told me privately, he goes, I'm grateful, especially during the pandemic. I'll take whatever work I can get. He listens to podcasts while he works, and he transforms what it is he's doing into something that is enriching for his soul and benefits his family. And it also makes you feel, male or female, whatever your identity is, you feel human in those moments, and people need to feel human, and a tragic environment like a pandemic will bring that to the forefront, and that's why everyone's so tired, I think. But I'm optimistic that a lot of people are going to realize now that they need to reevaluate how they spend their daily activities, and people are being forced into squeezed into a perspective and introspection that they might otherwise have been happy to ignore.
I think that introspection is really important, though. And, I guess going on the other side of the coin, in a somewhat positive light, if that can even be possible, is that a lot of people have gotten the chance to have that introspection. Like you said, you know, terrible thing losing a job, terrible thing losing a hobby, and something that maybe took up a lot of your time. But I think it kind of gives you an opportunity to sit back and really think about your next steps. And in this case, you've got like 5 months plus change to think about your next
Oh
steps,
yeah.
right? And like we were saying before, a lot of people don't have the luxury of that time. And maybe the pandemic has given them that time, obviously, with some government benefits coming in. It has given them the time to kind of get their life back on track. And I've had conversations with friends who have kind of facilitated a career change or facilitated, new hobbies and stuff like that. And this has given them the time to kind of explore that. And so it kind of introduces the question, like, I was saying before that work is valuable, but at the same time, like, when you have to work at a job that maybe doesn't give you meaning, is that work really good? I don't really think so. And what it means for work to be good, I suppose. But we're getting off track here.
Well, not there's no such thing as off track in a podcast, and look, we're talking about finance, we're talking about law. This is why I've kind of built this podcast more or less as covering law, politics, culture, and literature, because I think those four. I think well, I guess I just defined the humanities at large, but these things are going to rear their heads regardless. And so I know that you said a moment ago that people have had a time to reflect. For me, I'm very grateful that through a number of lucky, just through happenstance, the individual who replaced me when I had to leave the office because I was going to school, great guy, really terrific guy. I happened to call my boss because I was still on the payroll, right, as a part time whatever, and I said, "Hey, like I'm kind of home now. Do you need?" And he said, "Well, your replacement, this guy, is actually leaving to find another job. We need someone from May until August at the very least on a full time basis." So, absolutely. So I was able to work full time again from home, but that helped me eliminate debts. It helped me help out my friends and family who needed stuff. It was a blessing. There's no other word for that. Religious or irreligious, it doesn't matter. That kind of just, you know, the fabric of being thrusting something into your lap like that is a blessing. I don't think there's a better word for that. But yeah, it's actually helped me. It's woken me up, Alex, because it's so easy to go on autopilot, and that's an arrogant way of living because you just assume, or rather you presume, that everything around you that sustains you will last. And thankfully the power isn't out, and we're not, we're safe, more or less, despite the toilet paper raids in March. We're fine, right? And we should be grateful for that. But with that sort of boon to your life that comes out of nowhere, a kind of a responsibility kind of emerges. I know it's shifted my way of thinking about the law. People who don't know what to do if they need to pay their rent and can't, like, these people need advocates. Why am I pursuing this degree? To enrich myself? To, like, no, why would I do that? That's not, and I never had that intention. It's not like that's how I came into it. I had it because I love storytelling, and I think that the law is a form of a story. So, and you've heard me say that before, but we haven't even gotten to the point of the terminology of essential worker. That's a pit of snakes right there for anyone else. It's like, really, my job isn't essential. I know you're a big, more or less. I won't characterize your stance or anything, but I know in the past you've been a big NDP guy, and these guys are people who advocate for workers' rights and the value of the true value of labor as So I say that because I knew I had to mention that to you. Like the notion of calling some work essential and some not is a prickly little cactus right there.
It's a very interesting characterization. I like that you said that. I saw this funny picture, and it was, you know, those guys who flip signs by the highway as an advertisement, and as
Yeah.
a picture, then he had been defined as an essential worker, and he was like, "This is kind of ridiculous." I think we kind of run into a lot of those situations where people really don't think their job is essential, but it is. And that kind of goes off what you were saying before about a lot of these regulations going into place seeing almost haphazard and thrown together really quick, which I guess they were.
Yeah,
And this is a new situation for not only Canada, but a lot of the world. I guess some of the Asian countries went through previous scares with SARS and swine flu and similar other diseases that had bigger impacts elsewhere. But this has been the first kind of global impact that we've seen in our lifetimes. And I think leaders, regulators, and employees alike are kind of scrambling to figure out what the best thing to do is.
so my question for you then is, finance gets a bad rap, sometimes justified, sometimes not. Do you see a place in the world of finance for there to be, and I'm not talking about political governmental schemes and wealth redistribution, because that's kind of a bit of a cudgel, but within the world of finance itself, do you see a restorative role that the banks and financial institutions generally might be able to play, as we're, because I know nothing about finance, but one of the most interesting things to me throughout this whole experience has been, here's the stock market going to do, doing what it wants to do, and here are, here's the value. Again, very elementary understanding of all of this, but it's so. Do you think that there's a role for bank? Has your company addressed some of these sorts of things? And you can answer that in a number of ways within the company itself, right? Acknowledging that some people are, these are some people who are parents that have to, the quality of their work is going to diminish because they need to take care of family and kids and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But generally too, because I know that a lot of these corporations, you never hear it discussed because it's not sexy. I know a lot of corporations and banks as well, you know, they have mission statements. They have, they do reach out. They sponsor all kinds of charities, and I'm just wondering how that unfolds in the next 6 months, let's say. Or
So I want to touch on two things. First off, let's definitely touch on the role of financial institution during kind of like a recession, or in this case, I don't even want to classify this as a recession because it doesn't feel like a recession. It feels like a global impactful
pause.
issue. Yeah, in some sense. And so the first thing that we saw was payment deferrals for people who have mortgages, car loans, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, the banks kind of lost money in that sense because obviously they're going to earn interest on those. Like they're still going to make the payments. Don't get me wrong; it's just getting back ended onto the loan. But the banks are losing money now, and they're definitely companies that aren't doing the hottest right now with the default rates rising. So in that sense, in a capitalist environment, I think a pure-blooded economist would say that the banks don't necessarily have a restorative role. But I think in Canada, I think it's definitely been something that we've seen as happening in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
When whether or not that's kind of like a product of the way government regulation has kind of come into face with the economy in terms of interest rates and the prime rate and all those sorts of things, I think we've seen Canadian financial institutions really lead the way, not only in like what they're doing to help people, but also in things like you said, their mission statements and stuff like that. The other thing I want to touch on is that finance kind of has like be it a good or bad thing, a rap for being kind of like a work heavy environment, which is true to some extent.
Oh, what
But
environment? Sorry.
a work heavy environment. So,
Okay.
you're going to work here 8 to 8 every day and there's no ifs, then buts about it. But what I've seen, at least personally, has been really a shift in the whole work from home permanent movement where a lot of these companies now are being a lot more flexible than they used to be. Before, you would have a meeting at 8 a.m. and you'd have a doctor's appointment, but you'll have to cancel your doctor's appointment because they can't move that meeting. But now the reality is that everyone has a family, people have dogs, people have car issues they need to take care of. And I really like the kind of way that the finance world, not only just banks, but other people that I've spoken to at other companies have said that, senior management and the executive have become a lot more flexible in allowing people to kind of take care of their lives. And realistically, that's what we have to do. Work is valuable for sure, but at the same time, everyone has their own responsibilities they want to pursue.
Yeah, and life is short, as I said a moment ago. So if And you're right. It sounds so cliched, but it's true. A happy worker is a better worker. And my mom's company. She's not there now, but one of her she's in advertising. She is an advertising executive, and their ad agency that she was at for years and years and years was made famous by its founder, and his whole thing was you invest in people. Um,
Mm, I love that. Yeah.
it's a beautiful conceptual merger, right? Between well, it's exactly as it sounds. I have a tendency to try to over explain things, but it's exactly what it sounds like, and it's true because I don't care who you are, and I don't care what your ego is. It feels bad to feel that disconnect in the workplace. And again, my professional experience is limited to the one little 9 month period I had in an office and then shifting back to school. So I don't want to get too big for my britches. But I felt it and I still feel it sometimes where it's like, how can there be this much of a disconnect? And I remember hearing a philosopher talk about how, and again, I'm not going to go too far afield, but talking about how as human beings, our emotional systems are tied to, surprise, surprise, goal-oriented movement. So we experience this all the time. You're in the car or and the subway stops and you're furious because of God knows how many reasons. You're on vacation, the subway train stops, who cares, whatever, right? We are constantly doing this. And so you can bemoan your job and you can sit and say, oh, well, this is meaning, who cares? Feeling bad is feeling bad. And it sounds hippy dippy, but it's not because you get a person to do something for years and years, for hours and hours every day. That I don't care who you are, what you say, that is going to seep into your perspective and ultimately your being in a non-trivial way. So I think I'm more of a conservative guy than you if you want to put blunt labels on things, but I'm completely and wholeheartedly in agreement when it comes to we need to really assess what it is we're doing to the people that are sustaining our lives. I've been very lucky and grateful, or excuse me, I've been very fortunate and lucky, I should say, because a lot of my profs, I was surprised to see this. A lot of them emphasize the fact, and I was so happy to hear it, that our lives, the ability to go in and get a coffee and a muffin and then go sit in the lecture hall or now from home and all of that is sustained by people who produce the energy that keep the lights on and those people have families and objectives and how could you not be bitter if you see that the higher ups and the white collar folks like me, like you, aren't translating that? You see, they're not. There's a disconnect, and they're being revealed in on a daily basis because of COVID. So I've had my profs tell me like, don't be foolish. Be sensible and understand that you have an obligation. You have an obligation to practice the law, but in an ethical manner and not in some amorphous way. These are people. These are people's lives. I want to chat with you at one point about, and we can do this in person soon one day or over another Zoom call, but something I never thought I enjoyed, but made me think of you today because it's the only two things I did today. I had my mediation class, which was exactly what it sounds like. So instead of going to a courtroom, parties come and I guess on Zoom these days, chat and they discuss their issues. And the idea is to meet a common ground in the middle where the problems can be solved. So we can't divorce the human element from conflict and from finance and from value and from meaning and from all of these things. It's what we are, right? And so there's room for it. And you're right. I didn't even consider the fact that these deferrals on payments. I mean, who's making those decisions? It's the people who own the cars and the houses and all that. So make a good point. I hadn't even considered that. Yeah, incredible.
Is there anything else that you want to close on before we get on with our lives here?
No, I want you to. I want. I want you to. If there's anything, no, if there's anything pressing or something interesting that sparked a thought, but a minor thought that won't take me
Down the rabbit hole.
down
Oh,
the
I'm
path.
bad for it too, man. It's not just you, especially if something sparks an interest. I can
See,
talk about it at end.
here I'm gonna excuse myself, and I'm gonna give myself an excuse. You, my friend, are on the phone in Zoom calls, doing work, making cash. God bless you. I have to sit and get talked at in lectures, and I'm sitting there and I have no outlet. That's why I'm doing the podcast. So you are my latest victim of pent up energy and boredom. I just tell me some. I'll give you. Just tell me an interesting anecdote from the Zoom environment. Like what's been something funny or interesting in the work. So you're working, but what's something like funny or interesting? You can even be someone just like walking through the door, topless, or like silly, goofy things where kids run in, or someone's brushing his teeth and he's in his boxer shorts. Like it doesn't have to be that. But if you have a funny kind of quirky thing that would only happen in a bank on Zoom, I'd love to hear it. I'm putting you on the spot though, so if you don't
Absolutely. No, and I think it's a great question and something that I think every
notice, I didn't name the bank.
Thank you. That every white collar worker kind of like goes through, especially nowadays. And maybe you've experienced this too, being on. Do you guys use Zoom for your classes?
Of course, yeah.
Wow, Zoom is really like their market share.
Dude, Zoom did now. COVID.
Like, does everybody use it? That's crazy. We actually don't use Zoom regardless, but I use Zoom for like even my just like person-to-person interaction.
What do you guys use?
Microsoft Teams, but that's mostly just because it's like an enterprise software.
I've done that with some of the charity clients we have at work. When we're chatting amongst ourselves, it's Zoom, but otherwise, yeah, it's Microsoft Teams. I find quality's better, and the internet connection's almost always stronger. So,
yeah, honestly. But in terms of the quirkiness of COVID, I think it's just like the conference line meetings. You hear like the same thing. Every single call starts with the same 5 minutes of issue. It's almost predictable at this point. You can join a meeting 5 minutes late and you won't miss anything because there people are either having connection issues, video issues, audio issues, or having to dial in, or their screen isn't sharing properly. And trying to troubleshoot these things through the same call that you're participating in is impossible.
Oh, God. Or I guess last question, just because I'm trying to picture the work environment. You remember I mentioned the office towers. Did anybody leave Toronto? Okay, I'm going to head out to the cottage, or I'm going, to hang out with my cousins. And did people do they leave the city and now they're working remotely? Or most people?
It's a very interesting question. Personally, I don't think I've really discussed it with anybody that has expressly mentioned it. But funnily enough, I rented a car last weekend just to head home to see family. And I was talking to the car rental girl about, has it been, busy? Like, what's COVID been like for you guys? And they said exactly that it's been crazy busy because you'll meet a lot of white collar professionals who are working from home now. They just want to rent a car and go up to the cottage for a week and work from there. And I really don't see why you wouldn't get out of the city craziness. And there's really no downside at the end of the day. And like, I think that just has implications for remote work in general, where now companies, if remote work becomes a new normal, companies can now hire global talent instead of just local talent. And the implications for that, we can talk about at length. But in terms of productivity, maybe it'll be a good thing. But in terms of local employability, maybe not so much.
Which, it'll be very interesting. And that's the cliffhanger we'll end on. An hour and a half. I watch people do their podcasts, and I'm like, how are these idiots talking for an hour, 20 minutes?
I think we could have went longer, to be honest.
Well, this idiot chatted for an hour and a half. So I could go, but I mean, of course, we got stuff to do. But that was a blast, man. Thanks for taking the time, and
No, anytime. I'd be happy to be on again. Or if you want to have other people on, we could have like a broader group discussion. I think that'd be a lot of fun. Have you reached out to any of your friends at all?
About, oh yeah. I have a lot. I have a lot of. I have a lot of friends. No. I have a lot of friends that have been gracious enough to kind of make a comment and be a little supportive. Because as I said, this is just really for my own. Just to kill the time, but also
but it does take work, right? Like, you're not twiddling your thumbs there. You're doing something with your time.
Well, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to keep my mind busy while not being completely committed to school things. So I want to chat with classmates because I know that we can, pick up right where we left off. So yeah, I have spoken to other people. What I'm doing right now, and I'll just conclude on this note, is even today I got the new logo because I had a friend design something before. But because I've been doing the digital marketing work, I just reached out to our graphic designer and said, hey, can you do this? And then privately, I kind of hired him to build some digital assets, so a proper logo and a cover photo and all that. So that's coming through. So what I'm doing is this video is one of many.
Nice. That's good stuff.
Yeah, I think this video is going to be the first of, maybe 4 or 5, let's say, that I'm doing to keep the thing going until those digital assets and logos and the branding happens. And then because I have a fairly extensive knowledge of Facebook advertising. I've put aside some money just to, just to promote it to target audiences that I think might get a kick out of it. And then we'll see how long it goes because, this semester is going to fly and then we'll see how the next one goes. But yeah, this is the plan. And I've spoken to Eric. I've spoken to some others that we know, and they want to chat too. So of course we can facilitate a group thing for sure. But I do want to have you on again, of course, because it's been a blast, man.
Yeah, let's have some varied topics. I feel like how many podcasts are made this day about, COVID and COVID work and all that kind of stuff. It's crazy. But it's so interesting to talk about. It's almost it's tough not to, really.
Yeah. Well, we brought it back to what we've chatted about in the past. So we'll have room for more, and we can talk about anything. So perfect.
All right, man. But yeah, honestly, thanks so much. I had a lot of fun too. I always have a blast chatting with you. Hopefully we can meet up in person sometime soon.
Let's do it. Ontario's, but whatever. We'll see how. Absolutely. Let me know. And yeah, man, we'll do something. Stuff's still open. So, and I'm clean as far as I know. So we'll do something for sure, man. All right.
All right. You have yourself a good night. Yeah.
You too, man. Take care.